This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good evening. House leadership sources and friends of House Speaker Jim Wright now say they do expect Wright to resign, possibly next Wednesday. For his part, Wright said today he's waited a year for his side to be heard. CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Bob Schieffer has the latest.
Wright was still wearing his trademark smile as he left home this morning, but CBS News has been told his closest allies now expect him to resign on Wednesday, one day before the Ethics Committee meets to consider the charges against him. Under the scenario thought most likely, a caucus of all House Democrats would be called on Wednesday after the Memorial Day recess. Wright would make his case to his colleagues and then resign from Congress. Thus, when the Ethics Committee convened the next day, Wright would no longer be subject to a reprimand from the committee.
We have no jurisdiction on non-members.
As many of his colleagues told it today, Wright has simply seen the handwriting on the wall.
Jim is an old hand. He's an old Paul. He knows injured goods when he sees it, and he understands that the powerful, important, critical office of the Speaker has been injured.
Even so, Majority Leader Tom Foley, the odds-on favorite to replace him, maintained publicly that Wright is not planning to quit.
I have no plans for the Speaker to retire.
So as far as you know, there's no decision to retire or to resign?
No, I know of no such plan.
Denying in a statement that he had offered to resign yesterday if the Ethics Committee dropped some of the charges, Wright said there is no deal now, there will be no deal in the future. Sources say, however, that the committee yesterday was close to dropping one of the most serious charges, that Wright's Fort Worth friend George Malek had a direct interest in legislation at the time Wright's wife was on the payroll.
Came very close, and I think that still is a majority view of members of the Ethics Committee, in my opinion.
But other sources also said the committee wanted Wright to resign within 24 hours, and he refused. So as word of the negotiations spread, that deal fell apart. Wright's lead lawyer, Stephen Sussman of Houston, wanted to fight all of the charges down to the very end, but other advisors felt Wright's best option now was simply to seek a graceful exit. So his friends now believe he will resign next week after making the very best case he can to his colleagues. Dan?
Thanks, Bob. A potentially explosive decision today by President Bush. He officially branded 3 nations as unfair trading partners. That is under a provision of the 1988 Trade Reform Act passed by Congress. Topping the list is Japan. Correspondent Terrence Smith reports on the president's action and possible foreign reaction. Terry?
Dan, President Bush has decided to cite 3 friendly countries as decidedly unfriendly trading partners: Japan, as you mentioned, India, and Brazil. The administration was so concerned about foreign reaction to this decision, especially in Japan, that it postponed a news conference scheduled for this afternoon to give the countries involved advance notice. The Japanese response was not long in coming.
We think it is not fair approach or not right approach to single out certain countries or certain trade practices.
A tough new provision of the trade law, Super 301, calls on the president to single out the worst trade offenders and target them for possible retaliation if they fail to mend their ways in the next 12 to 18 months. Japan was cited for blocking its markets to U.S. supercomputers, satellites, and lumber. Brazil for its restrictions on import licenses, India for its restrictions on foreign investment. In Japan, American companies like Cray Research, a supercomputer manufacturer, say the barriers they confront are real.
We've done half the business here that we might be able to do if, in fact, the market were open.
Critics here at home contend that the U.S. trade actions are hypocritical since Washington imposes its own trade restrictions on items such as autos and foreign steel.
They have their barriers and we have ours. The Defense Department will not buy foreign computers from the Japanese or anyone else. That's a barrier. The Japanese could say it's an unfair one.
Officials who have negotiated these trade issues with the Japanese before say many of the problems are intractable.
We declared victory 5 times on some of these issues, and we still have the issue with us.
There'll be no immediate sanctions as a result of this action, but the fear in Washington is that the Japanese may retaliate with restrictions of their own and set the stage for a trade war. Dan?
Terry Smith, thanks. With Japan regularly accounting for 1/3 of the U.S. trade deficit, the Bush decision comes as an unpleasant non-surprise in Tokyo. CBS News correspondent Bill Whitaker is there.
The long-anticipated action is viewed by many Japanese as an unfair and high-handed U.S. trade practice. And more are asking why economic superpower Japan must once again yield to U.S. demands.
I think it will result in a kind of uproar. And even a very strong anti-American feeling might be unleashed.
The Japanese government, feeling economically secure yet hoping not to offend its #1 trade partner, is urging restraint.
We don't want to lose our patience, or we don't want to lose our reasonableness.
This trade flap comes at a time of growing strains in U.S.-Japan relations. Thousands protested revelations this month of a U.S. hydrogen bomb lost off Okinawa 24 years ago.
There's nothing about this that's fair.
Congressional resistance to building the FSX fighter plane with Japan is a TV news staple. Many here believe Japan is being used as a scapegoat for U.S. economic shortcomings.
Something must be done on the part of the United States to strengthen your competitiveness.
Motorola, America's biggest cell phone maker, has a competitive product, but complains trade barriers lock it out of the lucrative Tokyo market at a loss of $1 billion a year.
We would like equal access in the telecommunication marketplace for U.S. suppliers as Japanese manufacturers have in the United States.
While many Japanese resent being cited by the U.S. on trade, there are some here who admit without U.S. pressure, there will be no Japanese concessions. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Tokyo.
The U.S. government today said the nation's economy grew at a 4.3% annual rate in the first 3 months of the year. That was well below earlier estimates of the gross national product. Now, still to come on tonight's CBS Evening News, continuing political turmoil in the communist world. Richard Schlesinger on a marketing trend called Soviet chic, and Jerry Bowen on the unluckiest neighborhood in the country. Of new efforts by hardliners to reassert control over the country and the Communist Party. Prime Minister Li Peng made his first public appearance since he declared martial law in parts of Beijing 5 days ago. CBS News correspondent John Sheehan begins our coverage of the fight over what the new face of communism in China is to be and who is to lead it.
After being out of the public eye for several days, hardline Prime Minister Li Peng appeared tonight on state-run Chinese television. He was meeting some foreign ambassadors, not an important event, but it ran as the lead story on the nationwide evening news. His appearance was taken as a signal that in the ongoing power struggle, he has prevailed over party chief Zhao Xiang. That's bad news for the pro-democracy students camped in Tiananmen Square. In their confrontation with the Communist Party, all the students' previous demands boil down to one, that Li Peng resign. That is becoming less likely. Some of the student leaders favor pulling out of the square, but in a meeting today, a majority voted to stay. Zhao Xiang, the leader most sympathetic to the students, may still be the head of the party, but without power. All the signals say that he still has some room to maneuver, but does not have the backing of the Politburo or the military. 84-year-old Deng Xiaoping has emerged once again as the strong man. Western analysts in Beijing say that to predict how Deng will handle the students, they need only study his own past statements. Those who worship the democracy and freedom of the West, he has said, must be dealt with severely. Firm measures must be taken against any student who creates trouble at Tiananmen Square. And we cannot do without dictatorship. We must exercise it when necessary. Military commanders, however, are divided over whether troops should be used against unarmed civilians. And Western diplomats, Dan, conclude that China may be in for a long period of turmoil. The desire for democratization is so widespread, they say, that even if the students are brutalized this time, there will be more such revolts in the future. Dan?
Thank you, John Sheehan in China. All night long in Beijing, again, tens of thousands of pro-democracy demonstrators were camped out or marching in Tiananmen Square in defiance of the martial law decree. Correspondent Susan Spencer spent the night with them.
Tongjimen, Tongjimen, comrades, comrades. A professional choral group marches past the square calling the people, and the people come all night long. Vendors, workers, tourists, they come by the thousands.
Seems to have turned into a kind of happening now, yeah.
It's now well after midnight, and this area is still packed. For reasons social, historical, political, or whatever, this is clearly the place to be. By moonlight, the students inside the compound while away the hours the way students always do. They sing pop songs. They certainly seem safe. But those who travel far to see this site do so in part to make sure they're safe. Rumors of the Army moving in abound. Most people have no telephones. This is the only way to get information. And once they're here, the event itself becomes so compelling, they stay. How long will you stay?
I don't know, maybe the whole night.
The budding revolution provides much to see. Biggest attraction, the motorcycle vigilantes that zoom by. They are out patrolling for troops. The freedom even to be gathered here is itself exhilarating, something many Chinese thought they never would experience. Patriotic enthusiasm, this man says. I've got it, so I come. A new day dawns. The students wake up, prepare for the day ahead. Workers go off to their jobs. But this square is all anyone will think about today, and tonight they will be back. Susan Spencer, CBS News, Beijing.
Diplomatic sources, east and west in China, generally agree that what the Army does, which way it swings, continues to be the key as to what the country's leadership will be. Soviet television viewers saw something today they'd never seen before. Their communist government in action experimenting with limited forms of democracy. It was the first meeting of the new freely elected parliament, the Congress of People's Deputies. CBS News correspondent Barry Peterson reports that in this new ball game, Soviet leader Gorbachev was playing defense.
It was a political free-for-all. Mikhail Gorbachev under public attack for everything from his domestic policies to his wife's influence on his leadership. The day was still new when a delegate walked up and took control of the podium. Gorbachev had to give in. And give in again to Andrei Sakharov, who demanded discussion before choosing this country's president, not just a rubber stamp for Gorbachev. One delegate said of Gorbachev, "Don't be like Napoleon, whose wife pushed him onto a throne." Soviets watched open-mouthed as it all unfolded live on television. "It's great," said this man, "we need more." And there was more. By afternoon, people were skipping work to stay by television sets. They saw the first open challenge to Gorbachev, one man putting himself in nomination for the presidency. He couldn't get enough votes to make the nomination stick. Another put political maverick Boris Yeltsin into nomination. Yeltsin withdrew his name, saying later he knew he couldn't win. Gorbachev finally had to stand and explain his 4 years in power. A passionate, extemporaneous defense of his leadership, perhaps the most dramatic political speech of his career. "I will not abuse power if elected," he vowed. "I will pursue the changes toward democracy so this country can never again come under the influence of a dictator." Late tonight, Gorbachev got the one thing he was supposed to get, the formal election as president. At the same time, several thousand people tested his promise of more democracy. After a few tense minutes, an official called off police and let democracy in the streets, like the democracy in the meeting hall, go its own way. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Moscow.
Nicaragua expelled 2 U.S. diplomats today. The Sandinista government accused them of instigating strikes by Nicaraguan school teachers demanding higher pay. A U.S. embassy spokesman in Managua denied the charge. Why Why were former Reagan administration appointees and other well-connected Republicans receiving big money to be consultants on housing and urban development? Was it legal? Was it ethical? Today, the man who was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development all 8 years of the Ronald Reagan presidency tried to explain it to a congressional panel. CBS News reporter Ron Allen has more on where some of your tax money went.
Former President Reagan's Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Samuel Pierce, today offered his first public explanation of an influence peddling scandal uncovered by the agency's Inspector General last month. The auditor's report found that more than a dozen former Reagan appointees and high-ranking Republicans earned huge consulting fees by steering federal housing rehabilitation money to developers.
We should have gotten rid of this program, too.
Well, should you have gotten rid of it or should you have cleaned it up? I mean, you made the decision, or people in your office made the decision, that if you can't terminate it, then milk it.
No.
I mean, there were many other ways to go.
I didn't make that decision.
Well, somebody did, because it was milked.
The Inspector General estimated that questionable payments to consultants could cost taxpayers some $400 million. Consultants such as former Interior Secretary James Watt, who earned $300,000 by helping this Rhode Island developer receive a HUD grant.
Mr. Watt can get phone calls returned at HUD. I can't.
And consultant Frederick Bush, no relation to the president, who today denied using his ties to the administration to help earn $260,000 in consulting fees on a HUD project.
That I would never call someone and ask for a meeting and say, oh, by the way, I was the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Vice President.
Democrats reacted angrily to Pierce when he suggested without substantiation that Democrats had also pocketed large consulting fees from the program.
You've
made statements, highly irresponsible statements.
I don't think they're highly irresponsible.
You made an irresponsible statement. You can't back up.
I did not make any irresponsible statement.
You have said that there were
You got my statement.
After several hours of grilling, Pierce was more remorseful than defiant.
Perhaps we should have watched the program closer than we did.
Members of the committee faulted Pierce for not taking action, even though he was told of abuses in the program almost a year before he left office. Pierce's successor, Jack Kemp, has now suspended the program, and a Justice Department probe of possible criminal violations in the case continues. Ron Allen, CBS News, Washington.
A federal bankruptcy judge in New York today formally approved the sale of Eastern Airlines' New York, Boston, Washington shuttle to developer Donald Trump. By voice vote, a contract that would end the strike that has crippled the nation's second-largest school district for almost 2 weeks. The contract includes a 24% pay raise over 3 years and a greater voice for teachers in how their schools are run. A union spokesman said teachers could be back in the classrooms by tomorrow. In a tower of smoke and flame, death and destruction returned today to a San Bernadino, California neighborhood they also struck just a few days ago. Jerry Bowen reports.
It's the same working-class neighborhood where a runaway train killed 4 people and damaged or destroyed a dozen houses barely 2 weeks ago. The disaster this time, a major gas line explosion, the force leveling 10 more houses, killing at least 2 residents and injuring 26 others.
We couldn't see anything out the kitchen windows. Then all of a sudden, as soon as we turned around, the windows just bust open. They busted, I mean, just boom, boom, boom.
Flames erupted into a 500-foot torch. The intense heat incinerated cars and singed house pets 2 blocks away. Diane Tucker cut her arm breaking a window to escape.
Scared's not the word for it, okay? It's terrified.
The pipeline had been declared safe after the train accident, but company officials now see a connection.
Obviously, there's a correlation there. What it is, we don't know at this point.
Meanwhile, a Red Cross shelter's been opened for the neighborhood, and many residents find they've little desire or reason to return home.
My house was damaged from the train wreck a week or so ago. And then have this happen. Everything I have is gone. This is my house. This is my house.
Residents had been assured the neighborhood was safe after the derailment. Tonight, they aren't sure who or what to trust. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
Earlier this month, after President Bush offered cut-rate prices on wheat, the Soviet Union bought 300,000 metric tons of U.S. taxpayer-subsidized wheat from this country. At the same time, there are increasing signs that when it comes to trade, the Soviets know which side their bread is buttered on. Richard Schlesinger explains.
Yes, I want 2 loaves of the sweeter Perestroika bread.
It's not new, it's not even improved, but it's the real thing. Perestroika bread, baked fresh in Moscow and flown to New York, where it's selling like hotcakes.
Flown in from where? From Russia. From Russia? Yes.
Each loaf weighs 2 pounds and costs $6, $5.50 more than it does in Russia. And if you want some, get in line.
We are standing in line for bread like in Russia they do.
Perestroika bread owes its debut in American stores to Perestroika. Yeast meets West. It never could have happened before the Soviets loosened up, started making deals. Now this Moscow bread factory is bracing for a large American demand once word of the bread gets around. Galina Fedorovna says, I don't know how Americans will like it, but we can't live without it.
When Soviet President Gorbachev first burst on the world scene, everyone thought he was just a diplomatic genius. Now it turns out he may also be a genius at pushing merchandise.
I think Gorbachev, as the leader and the PR guy, is making everybody feel comfortable and good about the Soviet Union, and I think that it's going to be hot.
His smiling face looks down on trendy trade shows where there's not a tractor in sight. The Politburo's pushing perfume, sweatshirts, watches.
It's in to wear watches made in Moscow, but also because they are good watches. But this is not the first reason, I think.
Soviet style is sweeping Italy, where Red Army watches are selling for $100 a piece. They're red hot. And in the U.S., they're selling Russian watches as fast as they can get them. Soviet ideology might not sell here, but Soviet goods do. A country that used to say better dead than red is now buying better bread from Reds. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. We hope you'll join us for 48 hours. Tonight, the Civil War rages again as a forgotten regiment of black soldiers returns to action for Hollywood. That's 48 hours. Lights, camera, war. Coming up here soon at 8, 7 Central Time. Until then, Dan Rather.
Lights, camera, war. Forgotten heroes return to battle. A fight for respect then and now. Hollywood meets history. 48 hours tonight.
This is CBS.